The eggs were still warm when Diane slid the folder across the table. She did it between two sentences about nothing. Something about the weather turning, something about the drive back being longer than she remembered. And then the folder was in front of me, and she was looking at the grain of the wood instead of at my face. "There's a copy in there for you," she said, "of the will and a letter from Gerald. He's handling the estate." Gerald was her attorney. I had known this without being told, the way you know things about people who have been circling something for years. My father had been dead for 9 days. His chair at the head of the table sat empty. Diane had moved her coffee cup to it that first morning, and no one had said anything, and she had been drinking from it there every morning since. I opened the folder. The letter from Gerald was short and formal, and it said, in language designed to sound inevitable, that the lake house, the house my mother had bought before she met my father, the house where I had spent 22 summers, the house where my mother had died looking at the water, that house was now the property of my stepmother, Diane Ellen Marsh, and that she would need the keys by Sunday. "You understand, it was always his," Diane said, and she said it to my cousin Patricia, not to me, the way you'd explain something obvious to a child in the room. So it comes to me now, that's just how these things work. Every face at that table turned toward me. My cousin Patricia, my uncle Dennis, my father's sister Verna, who had flown in from Portland and was leaving that afternoon. Not one of them opened their mouth. I set my fork down. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. Though I want to be honest with you and tell you that what I felt in that moment was something colder than grief and harder than anger. It was the feeling of a person who already knows the answer to the question everyone else thinks is still open. I told Diane she could have the keys. I think I even smiled. What I did not tell her, what I would not tell a single person in that room for another 3 months, was that I had read the deed the night my father died. I had it memorized, and the lake house was never his to give away. Before we get started, if you're new here, please subscribe. It helps the channel grow and reach more people. My name is Ruth. I was 58 that spring, and I had spent most of my adult life being the kind of person other people make decisions about without consulting. Not unkindly, always. That is the harder part to explain. It was not malice. It was the quiet assumption that Ruth would manage, that Ruth would understand, that Ruth was not the sort of person to make a scene over things. I had, in fact, never made a scene over anything. I want you to hold that thought because it matters later. Before I tell you what happened over those 3 months, I want to tell you what the lake house actually was, because the value of a thing is its whole story, and Diane only ever knew the price. My mother, Helen, bought that house in the spring of 1971. She was 32 years old. She was teaching 3rd grade at Millward Elementary, and she had been saving since she was 26. She bought it alone, in her name alone, with her own money. She had not yet met my father. She would not meet him for another 4 years. She took me there the summer I turned 9, and on the second afternoon she sat me down at the kitchen table with a glass of sweet tea and a piece of paper. She explained, slowly and carefully, that this house was mine, not hers and mine, but mine, and that there was a man in town named Harold Fitch who kept a copy of that fact, and that if anything ever happened and someone tried to tell me otherwise, I should say the name Harold Fitch out loud and see what happened to their face. I thought it was a strange thing to tell a child. She seemed to find it very reasonable. She told me the name twice, Harold Fitch. I was 9 years old and I memorized it the way children memorize the things that feel important, even before they understand why. My mother died in the front bedroom of that house in October of 2009. She was looking at the water. The last clear thing she said to me was that the tin box in the left drawer of the kitchen dresser had copies of everything, and that I should make sure I was the one to go through it before anyone else had the chance. I did not understand the weight of that instruction until 9 years later, when my father married Diane. He was happy. I want to say that plainly because it is true, and because it is easy to lose in what comes next. Walter was happy with Diane, and she was, in the first years, genuinely good to him. She cooked for him, and she organized his medications, and she took him to his appointments without complaint, and I was grateful for that. I still am. But I also watched, in those 9 years, the way she moved through his life and began, slowly, to rearrange it. Small things first, a different chair, his books in boxes in the garage to make room for her things, the way she referred to his possessions as ours, and then, gradually, as mine. She was like someone who finds a house with a long driveway and starts driving up it a little farther each month just to see if anyone comes out to stop them. No one came out. My father died on a Wednesday in March, and on the 10th day, Diane slid a folder across the breakfast table and spoke to my cousin Patricia instead of to me. She knew the price of that house. She thought she knew its history. She didn't know the name Harold Fitch. I drove out to the lake that same afternoon. I want to tell you, I went there to think, to grieve, to make a plan. The truth is simpler. I needed to stand on the dock and make sure I still could. There are things you check on when someone tells you that you don't belong somewhere. The road up to the house is a county road that turns to gravel about a mile out, and the gravel is always too loud under the tires, and I have always loved that about it. You always know when someone is coming. My mother used to say it was better than a doorbell. I pulled in just after 3 o'clock, and the screen door on the back of the house was open, which meant Earl was there. Earl Tomlin had been the caretaker of that property for going on 41 years. He had cut the grass and patched the roof and cleared the gutters every fall, first for my mother, and then, after she died, for my father. He charged a flat rate that hadn't changed in 15 years. He sent his invoice in an envelope with a handwritten address to whoever's name was on the deed. When my father moved in after my mother died, he switched the bill to Walter. Walter was the occupant. Walter got the invoice. That was the only change Earl ever made to the arrangement. Earl was down at the water line when I came around the corner of the house, coiling the hose in that slow, methodical way he had, like everything was worth doing once and doing right. He raised one hand without turning around. He always knew the sound of my car. "Your daddy know you're out here?" he said, and then he stopped, and his face did something quiet. "I'm sorry, Ruth. I keep forgetting he's gone." "It's all right, Earl," I said. "I keep forgetting who it belongs to now." He looked at me a moment longer than the words deserved. There was something in his expression I did not have a name for at the time. Something between understanding and a question he had decided not to ask yet. "I expect you remember just fine," he said, and he went back to coiling the hose. I stood on the dock for a long time. The lake in March is not the lake in July. It is gray and flat, and there is a smell of cold mud from the far bank. But it was still the lake. The dock boards were soft under my feet the way they always were in early spring. My mother had stood in this same spot more times than I could count. I had stood here the day we scattered her ashes, which we did not scatter in the lake, because she had been specific about that too. Helen was always specific. But we had stood here, and I had understood that some places are just places until someone you love stands in them enough times, and then they become something else. I went inside. I went to the kitchen dresser, the left drawer. Oh, the tin box was still there. It was an old tea tin, green with a painted rooster on the lid, and it had been in that drawer since before I was born. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where my mother had explained the name Harold Fitch to a 9-year-old, and I opened it. Inside, a copy of the original deed, dated May 1971, my mother's name at the top and mine below. A letter in her handwriting, addressed to me, dated 1987, the year she and my father married, and a smaller envelope sealed that said on the outside, in her careful print, "For Ruth, if it ever comes to this." I sat with those documents for a long time. I am going to tell you what they said, but I am going to tell you in the right order, because that is how my mother meant it to be told. What I can tell you now is that I left the house that afternoon knowing two things with absolute certainty. The first was that the lake house was mine. Not symbolically, not emotionally, but legally and documentably mine, in a way that was not open to interpretation. The second was that my mother had known, 40 years before that breakfast table, that this moment would come. Not this exact moment, not Diane specifically, but something like it. Some person at some table who would slide a folder across and speak to someone else in the room instead of to her daughter. Helen had prepared for it. She had done it when she was 32 years old, before she ever met my father, before she had any idea what the next 50 years would look like. She just decided, quietly and without drama, that this one thing would not be taken from her daughter. And then she had put a tea tin in a drawer and waited. I thought about that on the drive home, the patience of it, the faith it required to make that kind of arrangement and not be there to see it used. I put the tin box in the trunk of my car. I did not, on the drive home, think about the look on Diane's face when it all came apart. I want to be honest with you about this. I thought about it a little. There was something small and not particularly dignified in me that turned that image over a few times. I let it, and then I let it go. I called my own attorney the next morning, not Harold Fitch. Harold had retired in 2008, and his practice had been taken over by a woman named Sandra Cole, who had clerked for Harold for 12 years, and who, it turned out, knew my mother's file the way some people know a piece of music they have been playing for decades. Sandra listened to what I told her, and she was quiet for a long time. And then she said, "Ruth, I've been waiting for someone to call me about this." I asked her what she meant. She said she would explain in person. She said to bring the tin box. Before I get to what Sandra told me, I need to tell you about the 3 months in between. Because what happened in those 3 months is the part that mattered. The letter from Gerald arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after the breakfast. It was 2 pages, single-spaced, and it had the particular smell of language written to discourage rather than to inform. Gerald had prepared it carefully. It cited the will, which left my father's estate, including all real property, to Diane. And it cited the 9 years of maintenance records, utility bills, and property tax payments that had been made in my father's name. It noted that the deed of record was, in its current filing, ambiguous, and that Diane intended to petition for a corrected title. I want you to understand what that last sentence meant. It meant that Gerald had done a title search. He had found the 1971 deed with my name on it, and rather than stopping there, he had constructed an argument that the deed was old, possibly superseded, and certainly worth contesting. He had found the loose thread, and he was going to pull it. I read the letter twice. I put it on the kitchen table. I went and made myself a cup of coffee, and I stood at the window for a while. I called Sandra and read her the relevant sections. She listened without interrupting. "Don't respond to Gerald directly," she said. "Don't respond at all. I'll reach out to him on Monday." "What should I do in the meantime?" I asked. "Nothing," she said. "That's the hardest part, and it's the most important one." She was right on both counts. What I did not do, I did not call Diane. I did not call Patricia or Dennis or Aunt Verna. I did not post anything, write anything, or say anything to any member of my father's circle about the deed, the tin box, or the name Sandra Cole. What I did do, I went to the lake every Thursday the way I always had. The house had not been formally transferred. Gerald's letter was an intention, not a completed action. And until it was, I had every right to be there. I would let myself in with my key. I would make tea. I would sit on the dock if the weather allowed. I would leave. Earl was there most Thursdays. We did not discuss the situation directly. He was not a man who discussed situations directly. But on the 3rd Thursday, while he was replacing some weathered boards on the far side of the dock, he said, without looking up, Your daddy used to tell people this was your mama's house. Anybody asked him, that's what he said. That house is Helen's. Said it like a fact. Did he say that to Diane? I asked. Earl drove in a nail. Don't know what he said to her. Only know what I heard. What did you hear? He looked up at me then, and something in his face was very old and very sure. Same thing I always heard, he said, that it was Helen's. Then he went back to the boards. The locks changed on a Saturday in late April, 7 weeks after the breakfast. I found out because I drove up on a Thursday and my key would not turn. I stood at the back door for a moment, and then I walked around to the front, and I tried that key, and I stood there looking at the lake for a few minutes. Earl's truck was not in the drive. I got back in my car and I drove home, and I called Sandra. She's entitled to change the locks, Sandra said, for now. It doesn't establish possession. I know, I said. Are you all right? I thought about it honestly. I'm more all right than she knows, I said. But I want to be honest with you, because I said at the beginning that I would be. I was not entirely all right. There is a difference between knowing something legally and feeling it in your body, and when I could not turn that key. When I stood at the door of the house my mother had bought with her own money at 32 years old, the house where she had died, the house I had come to every Thursday of my adult life, I felt the wrongness of it in a way that no deed language could fully reach. I sat in my car at the end of the road for about 10 minutes before I drove home. I am telling you this because the story I am telling is not about being above the hurt. It is about what you do with it. What happened next came in layers, the way it always does when someone decides they have won. Diane moved quickly. Within 2 weeks of changing the locks, she had hired a cleaning service to come through the house. I knew this because Patricia told me Patricia, who I had thought of as a neutral party, had apparently been having regular calls with Diane throughout this whole process, which I did not know, and which Patricia did not mention until she said at lunch, Diane just wants to be able to use the space, Ruth. You have to understand her position. I ordered a salad and I let Patricia talk for a while. She had a lot to say. Diane had been very put upon. Diane had been doing most of the caretaking toward the end. Diane had given up a lot for my father, and it was natural that she would want to feel settled in the property that was now hers. She told you it was hers? I said. Patricia looked a little uncertain. Well, it's in the will. Right, I said. I did not say anything else about it. Patricia looked at me with the expression people wear when they have been expecting a fight and aren't sure what to do with the absence of one. She changed the subject. I let her. After lunch, I sat in my car, and I will tell you the thing I thought, which is not a flattering thought. I thought, she is going to feel so stupid. Not Diane. Patricia. Diane was doing what she thought she was entitled to do, with information she believed was complete. Patricia, who knew me and knew my mother and had been at every summer on that lake, Patricia was choosing Diane's version of events without asking me a single question. She is going to feel so stupid. And then I thought, that is not a generous thing to think about someone who is also grieving my father. Both of those things were true at once. I let them both be true, and I drove home. The second layer came in May. Diane had a landscape crew come in and remove the 3 birch trees along the east side of the property. My mother had planted those trees. I know this is a small thing in the larger account. I know it is not the point. But if you have ever stood in a place that belonged to someone you loved and watched that place be changed by someone who doesn't know what it means, you will understand why I am telling you about the birch trees. I found out from Earl, who called me for the first time ever. He had my number from the invoice arrangements, and who said simply, "She's got a crew out here taking down your mama's trees. Thought you should know." "Thank you, Earl," I said. A pause. "You want me to say something?" "No," I said. "Let her." Another pause. "All right," he said, and he hung up. I did say something to Sandra, not about the trees themselves, but about the pattern, the cleaning crew, the locks, and now the trees. I said I was worried that Diane was establishing possession in a way that would be harder to undo later, that she was changing the character of the property. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Ruth, in a few weeks, none of this will matter. Not the locks, not the trees. Because what she's doing right now, she's doing to a property that isn't hers. Every change she makes is a change she made without authorization. That's not possession. It's trespass. And it's a very different thing in front of a judge." I had not thought about it that way. "Let her keep going," Sandra said, and there was something almost amused in her voice. "She's building our case for us." The third layer, and the worst one, came in June. My father's sister, Verna, called me from Portland. Verna was 81 and she had known my mother since before I was born, and she had always been, in my accounting, one of the people I trusted. She called on a Sunday evening and she said, with real sadness in her voice, that she thought I was handling this wrong. "You need to let it go, Ruth," she said. "The house is Diane's, and fighting it is only going to exhaust you and make everyone miserable. Your father loved her. He would have wanted her to have it." "What makes you think I'm fighting it, Verna?" I said. She seemed confused. "Well, I assumed. Patricia said—" "I haven't filed anything," I said. "I haven't said anything publicly. I've just been going to the lake on Thursdays the way I always have." "The keys, though," Verna said. "Diane says you've been using your key to let yourself in." "I was," I said, "until she changed the locks 7 weeks ago." A silence. "I didn't know she'd changed the locks," Verna said slowly. "She did," I said, 7 weeks ago." Another silence. I could hear Verna thinking, recalibrating. The version of events she had been given did not match the version she was hearing now, and she was 81 and sharp enough to know the difference. "What is it you're waiting for, Ruth?" she asked. "The right moment," I said, "to let the papers speak, the same way Mama always said." Verna was quiet for a long time. Then, "Helen said that to you too?" "More than once." Another pause, and then Verna said something that surprised me. "She said it to me in 1974, before she married your father. I didn't know what she meant then." A beat. "Maybe I do now." "She didn't ask me anything else. She said she was sorry about the trees, which meant Earl had told her, and she said goodnight. I sat at my kitchen table after that call, and I did something I had not done since the morning of the breakfast. I cried, not about the house, or not only about the house, but about my mother, and the length of time she had thought about this, and the way her instructions were still moving through people who had loved her, 40 years after she had given them, like light from something very far away. Then came the day in July that I had been waiting for, without knowing I was waiting for it. Diane filed the petition for the corrected title. Sandra called me at 8 in the morning. "Gerald filed yesterday," she said. "He's claiming the 1971 deed is superseded by your father's uninterrupted possession and tax payment record, and he's requesting a court order to clear the title in Diane's name." "Can he get it?" I asked. A pause that was a half-second too long. "It's not automatic," Sandra said. "The 1971 deed is on record, and your name is on it. But Gerald is making an argument that 9 years of joint use and tax payment establishes an implied transfer. It's not a strong argument, but it's not nothing." "What do we need?" I said. "I want to get into the full file before we respond," she said. "There's something I need to look at. Can you come in Thursday?" "Yes," I said. "Bring the tin box," she said. "And Ruth, don't lose sleep over this." I did not entirely succeed at that instruction. I want to tell you something true about the weeks between Gerald's filing and my Thursday with Sandra, which is that doubt is a very specific thing. It is not the same as fear. I knew the deed existed. I knew my name was on it. I knew the tin box was in my trunk and that my mother had been a careful woman who did nothing by accident. But Gerald had said one thing in his filing that I could not entirely dismiss, and it had to do with the 9 years of Diane and my father's marriage. In those 9 years, there had been paperwork. There had been refinancing discussions around 2016. My father had mentioned something about pulling equity for repairs, and I had not paid close attention because I had not understood yet what I now understood. There had been a lawyer, not Sandra, someone Diane had recommended, who had helped my father restructure some accounts after the marriage. What I did not know was whether any of that paperwork had included the lake house, whether my father, at some point in those 9 years, had signed something that altered the arrangement my mother had made in 1971, a quitclaim deed, a title transfer, something that intentionally or through carelessness had changed what was supposed to be unchangeable. I did not think my father would have done that knowingly, but I also knew that my father, in the last years of his life, had been tired and had trusted Diane with the paperwork and had signed things without always reading them thoroughly. He had told me this himself, laughing, the way you laugh about things you shouldn't be laughing about. In the second week of July, I drove to the lake because I needed to think, and I could only think there. The new locks were on the doors. The birch trees were stumps. There was a welcome mat I had never seen before on the front step. I walked around to the dock and I sat. Earl came out from the side yard. He sat down next to me without being asked. This was unusual. Earl was not a man who sat down uninvited. "You're worried," he said. "Yes," I said, "about whether she got to it first." I looked at him. "What do you know about that?" He took a long time to answer. "I know your daddy. Knew him, I mean. And I know he was a good man who got tired." He picked at a splinter on the dockboard. "Last summer, there was a man came out here with Diane, wore a suit. They walked around the property for a while, the two of them. Your daddy wasn't with them." I felt something cold move through me. "Did they go inside?" I asked. "They had a key," Earl said. "Did you hear anything? Did you see anything they carried in or out?" He shook his head. "Just the walking around, and the man had a folder." I sat there looking at the water, and I tried to decide whether I was going to be sick. A man with a folder walking the property with Diane while my father wasn't there. "When was this?" I said. "August," he said. "August of last year." 7 months before my father died. I called Sandra from the dock. She answered on the second ring. "Is there any way Diane could have gotten my father to sign over his rights in the property without me knowing?" I asked. "Without it showing up immediately in the deed record?" A pause. "Not permanently," Sandra said carefully. "A transfer would have to be recorded to be enforceable, but there are preliminary instruments, option contracts, side agreements, that could create a claim, especially if Gerald can argue your father signed them with full understanding." "What would you need to defeat that?" "The original structure," she said. "Ruth, there's a reason I've been waiting to pull the complete file. Harold left notes that I haven't fully gone through yet. I wanted to do it with you in the room. Can you come in tomorrow instead of Thursday?" I said yes. I drove home. I did not sleep. In the morning, I got the tin box out of my trunk and I sat at the kitchen table and I read everything in it again. The deed, the letter from 1987, the sealed envelope. And I understood fully for the first time what my mother had actually built. Sandra Cole's office was on the second floor of a brick building on Merchant Street, above a dry cleaner, and it smelled like old paper and the particular dust of document storage, which is a smell I have always found more comforting than I probably should. She'd been Harold Fitch's clerk for 12 years, and she had kept every file he had ever touched, organized by client and by year, in a system that was entirely her own and that she could navigate in the dark. She had my mother's file on the desk when I came in. It was thicker than I expected. Sandra poured coffee without asking, and she sat across from me, and she opened the file, and she said, "Let me tell you what your mother did." Helen had come to Harold Fitch in April of 1971, 1 month before she closed on the lake house. She had come with a specific request, Not just a deed in her name, but a structured arrangement that Harold had described in his notes as an interposition of ownership and use rights, intended to be durable against subsequent marital interests. I want to translate that because it took me a moment to understand it myself. What Helen had done was separate the lake house into two legal layers. The first layer was ownership, the actual property, which was deeded directly to Ruth, her daughter, who was 5 years old when Helen signed the papers in May of 1971. Helen had structured it as a present, recorded transfer. Ruth's name was on the deed from the first day, clearly and on record. The afternoon at the kitchen table when Ruth was 9. The sweet tea, the name Harold Fitch. That was Helen explaining what already existed, not creating it, making certain her daughter knew. The second layer was use rights, the right to occupy, maintain, and enjoy the property, which was retained by Helen, and upon her marriage, extended to include her spouse for the duration of her life, and in the event of her death, for a defined period not to exceed the end of her spouse's natural life. That defined period ended when my father died. The night my father died, the use rights expired. The property, which had always been mine in the ownership layer, became mine in every practical layer simultaneously. There was nothing to transfer. There was nothing to contest. My father had never owned the lake house. He had lived in it with my mother's permission, and after my mother died, he had lived in it with the permission built into the original instrument. He had paid the taxes and the maintenance because that was the obligation attached to his use rights, just as a tenant pays utilities. He'd never had the right to give it to anyone, not to Diane, not to anyone. He could not because it was not his. I sat across from Sandra and I held this information and I tried to take it in. She did all of this in 1971, I said, before she met him. Before she met him, Sandra confirmed. Why? How did she know she would need to? Sandra turned a page in Harold's notes. His handwriting was very small and precise. She didn't know, she said. According to Harold's intake notes, she was just clear. She knew she wanted this house to belong to her child, whoever that child turned out to be. Sandra looked up at me. She said, and I'm quoting Harold directly, "I have worked too hard for something that should be mine to watch it become someone else's by accident of marriage." She was 32 years old. I thought about my mother at 32, teaching 3rd grade, saving up for years, driving out to look at this lake house before she had made an offer, probably, the way you look at something you have been planning for long enough that it feels inevitable. Making an appointment with a young attorney named Harold Fitch and laying out with perfect calm the architecture of a protection she would not need for 40 years. "Did she ever tell him?" I said. "My father." "Not informally," Sandra said, "but Harold's notes from the 1987 filing, when Helen married your father, include a memo about a conversation he had with your father where he explained the full structure at Helen's request. Your father signed an acknowledgement." She slid the page across the desk toward me. He knew what he was signing. He knew the house was not his. I looked at my father's signature at the bottom of the page. His handwriting, 1987, when he was 44 years old and had just married the woman he would love for the next 22 years. He had known. He had known for 37 years. And he had said, Earl had heard him say it more than once, that house is Helen's. He had said it to people who asked. He had said it as a fact because it was a fact, and because he was, whatever else might be said about the last years of his life, a man who had respected that fact. What he had not done was tell Diane. I do not know why. I have my guesses, and none of them are entirely fair to him, and some of them are entirely fair to Diane. What I know is that when Gerald did the title search and found the 1971 deed, he had found the surface of it, my name, the date, and had decided it was old and ambiguous. He had not gone to Harold Fitch's successor. He had not read the instrument fully. He had found what looked like a loose thread and pulled it, not knowing that the thread was load-bearing, not knowing that the whole fabric had been woven around it. What about the man with the folder? I said. Last August, Diane walked the property with someone. Sandra nodded. Gerald filed a preliminary valuation request last August. I found it in the county records. He was assessing the property for the estate plan. She paused. He was working on this before your father died, Ruth. Diane had Gerald preparing the estate claim before your father was gone. I sat with that. Does that matter? I asked. It matters for context, Sandra said. In terms of the legal outcome, no. The structure of the 1971 instrument is airtight. Harold was very good at what he did. I have been looking at this file for a week, and I cannot find a single gap. She closed the folder. Gerald's petition is going to fail. It was always going to fail. He just didn't know what he was walking into. How long? I said. 2 weeks, she said. Maybe 3. I'll respond to his filing this afternoon. Once I lay out the full instrument and the 1987 acknowledgement, your father's signature. It's over. Gerald will advise her to withdraw. I picked up my coffee cup. It had gone cold. Does Diane know what she didn't know? I said. Sandra looked at me carefully. She'll find out when Gerald reads my response. I thought about that. Diane reading Gerald's face when he called her. The folder that had seemed so certain sliding back across a table in the other direction. Okay, I said, and I put my cup down. Let's respond. Sandra sent her response on a Thursday afternoon. It was 14 pages. I did not read all of it. She had prepared a summary for me, 2 paragraphs that told me everything I needed to know. But what I understood was that it included the full text of the 1971 instrument, Harold's original notes, the 1987 acknowledgement with my father's signature, and a cover letter to Gerald that was, in Sandra's words, very clear. She called me Friday morning. Gerald called at 9, she said. He'd read it by 8. What did he say? He asked for time to advise his client, she said. I told him he had until Monday. I went to the lake on Thursday. Out of habit or respect or something I don't have a complete word for, I parked at the end of the gravel road and I walked down to the dock and I sat. The locks were still changed. I did not try the door. I just sat on the dock for a while, and after about 20 minutes, Earl appeared from the side of the house with 2 cups of coffee, which he had never done before in 41 years. He sat down and handed me a cup, and we looked at the water. She called me, he said. Diane, yesterday. I looked at him. Asked me if I'd ever heard your daddy say anything about the house being in your name. He drank his coffee. I told her what I told you, that he always said it was Helen's, that he'd never said anything different, not one time in 9 years. What did she say? Nothing, Earl said. She just said thank you, and she hung up. We sat there a while longer. The water was very still. The stumps where the birch trees had been were beginning to green around the edges, which I had not expected. Apparently, birch stumps will do that, put out new growth, even after they have been cut. Earl, I said, who have you been sending the invoice to, since my father died? He looked at me sideways. Sent it to Walter while he was here, he said. Man lives in a house, man gets the bill. That's how it works. He paused. After he passed, I switched it back. Back to where? Back to where it started, he said. The account your mama set up. He looked at the water. Figured that was right. Diane called me directly on Sunday morning. She had never called me before. We had not spoken since the breakfast table. I saw her name on my phone, and I sat with it for a moment before I answered. Ruth, she said. Her voice was flat, not angry, empty. The voice of someone who has been prepared in the last 48 hours for a loss they were not expecting. Diane, I said, Gerald says the house is yours. A pause. He says it was always yours. Yes, I said. Your father never told me. Her voice broke very slightly on the word told, and then steadied. Did he know? I could have said many things here. I had thought about what I would say in this moment, and I had options, and most of them were honest. What I chose to say was, He knew. He respected what my mother built. A long silence. She did it before she even knew him, Diane said slowly, not as a complaint, more like she was saying it to herself, testing the shape of it, understanding, maybe for the first time, the scale of what she had not known. Yes, I said. Another silence. I let it be. I'll have the locks changed back, she said. I'll have Gerald contact Sandra about the petition. I appreciate that, I said. The trees, she said, and then she stopped. It's all right, Diane, I said, and I meant it, or most of it. It's not, though, she said. I'm sorry about the trees. We did not say very much after that. There was not very much to say. She had not been a villain in the way stories need a villain. She had been someone who thought she knew something, who had built a plan on top of an assumption, and who had not checked the foundation. My father had not told her. That is the part I have sat with the longest, and I still do not have a clean answer for it. Maybe he meant to and didn't. Maybe he thought she knew. Maybe he was tired and it was complicated, and there was never a good moment, and then there was no moment left. I have let that sit unresolved because I think it deserves to. The petition was withdrawn the following Tuesday. Sandra sent me a brief email with 2 words. It's done. The locks were rekeyed to my original key within the week. I did not tell Patricia or Dennis or Verna before it was finished. Verna called me 2 days after, and she had clearly spoken to Diane, and she was quieter on the phone than I had ever heard her. She said, "Your mother was something else." Yes, I said. She was. I went to the lake the first Thursday after the petition was withdrawn, the way I always go on Thursdays, and I let myself in with my key. The house was quiet and it smelled like itself. Lake wood and old curtains and whatever gets into the walls of a place when enough summers have passed through it. The welcome mat Diane had put on the front step was gone. She had taken it with her, which I thought was fair enough. I walked through the rooms slowly. Some things had been moved. A lamp in the wrong corner, the kitchen chairs not quite where they had been, the shelf in the hallway slightly rearranged. I did not fix any of it immediately. I just walked through and looked at what was there and what had changed and let it be what it was. In the kitchen, I opened the left drawer. The tin box was where I had put it back after I had taken it to Sandra. The letter from 1987 and the sealed envelope were inside, along with the copy of the deed. I had the original at Sandra's office, filed and indexed and very unlikely to be misplaced by anyone. I opened the sealed envelope. I had read it before, once, the night my father died, by the light of my phone flashlight, sitting at the same table with the house dark around me. But I read it again now in daylight because some things need to be read more than once before they land completely. It was 2 pages in my mother's handwriting dated October 2009, 3 weeks before she died. She knew she was dying. The handwriting was a little unsteady but very clear. Helen was always very clear. She told me about the house, about why she had built it the way she had. She said she had not done it out of distrust of my father. She had loved my father. She wrote that plainly. But because she had learned, watching the women around her in her lifetime, that the things women build have a way of dissolving into the larger accounts of the men they're attached to. And she had decided early that this one thing would not dissolve. This one thing would stay named for who it belonged to. She said she hoped I would forgive her for keeping it quiet so long. She said she had always meant to sit down with me properly and explain it, but there was never a right time while she was well, and then there was no time. She said, "I trust that if this letter ever needs to matter, you will have found it when it needs to matter. You have always known which drawer." The last paragraph was short. It said, "Keep the screen door the way it is. I know you think it's too late to fix it. I think it's exactly right." I folded the letter. I put it back in the tin box. I put the tin box back in the left drawer. I made a cup of tea and I took it out to the dock and I sat in the last of the afternoon light. And I listened to the lake and I thought about my mother at 32. Younger than my daughters are now, standing on this same dock, looking at this same water, deciding that some things should be built to last. Earl came down to the water line after a while and started coiling the hose. He raised one hand without looking up. I raised mine back. The screen door hung open behind me, catching the light, still crooked, still catching on the third hinge, the way it always had. I have never fixed it. I don't intend to.